So imagine you're watching a movie where every action and choice of the characters is scripted in advance. Now imagine at the end of the movie, the director steps out and punishes the characters for the bad things they did, even though he wrote the script. Now see, that scenario would seem completely unfair, right? Now, this illustrates why free will is such an important topic in theology. If our choices are entirely predetermined by God, can we truly be held accountable and responsible for them? You see, free will undergirds justice, moral accountability, and even love. Without genuine choice, the ideas of sin, obedience, reward, or punishment start to lose their meaning. From a Christian standpoint, free will is linked to the nature of a loving relationship with God, who wants us to choose Him voluntarily rather than automatons. But what about Islam? You see, Muslims also speak of humans making choices, yet Islamic theology has a strong doctrine of predestination. It's called Qadar, that can appear to override free will. Now let's explore the question of whether Islam allows for true free will. I think it doesn't, but that's my bias. We will look at the Islamic sources and what they say about predestination, the moral and philosophical dilemmas it raises, and then compare it with a Christian perspective. Now, this matters because it touches on how we view God's justice and love. It's foundational issues for both faiths. Now, if you're a Christian wanting to understand Islam or a Muslim curious about how free will aligns with God's will, stick around. We will be discussing these topics respectfully, referencing the Quran, the Hadith, and the Bible. Now, in Islamic belief, Qadar, or divine predestination, is one of the 6 articles of faith for Sunni Muslims. A Sunni Muslim is thus required to believe that Allah has ordained everything that happens in the universe. Now, both the Quran and Hadith emphasize Allah's sovereignty over every event and action. For example, the Quran says in Surah 14 verse 4 that Allah leads astray whom He wills and guides whom He wills. Now the Quran also states in Surah 7 verse 178 that whoever Allah guides is rightly guided, and those He sends astray are the losers. Now, these verses show that Allah is actively guiding some people to the truth and actively misguiding others according to His will, not merely His foreknowledge. Now, Islamic tradition teaches that this predeterminism started at creation. Now, one hadith in Sunan Tirmidhi, hadith 2155, says that the first thing Allah created was the pen, to which He said, write, and it wrote everything that would happen until the day of judgment. Now, hence why every detail of history, including all human deeds, is written in Allah's decree. Now, another notable hadith is found in Sahih Bukhari, hadith 6614, and Sahih Muslim, hadith 2652, wherein Moses is confronting Adam for committing the sin that led mankind out of paradise. Now, Adam replies to Moses, "Do you blame me for doing something Allah decreed for me before He created me?" Now, see, the Prophet Muhammad said Adam's argument confuted Moses. Now, this implication is that Adam's sin was foreordained by God decades before Adam was created. He had no choice in the matter. Now, early Muslim theologians attempted to reconcile these teachings. The dominant Sunni school, Al-Ash'ari, concluded that Allah is the creator of all human acts, good or bad. Now, to preserve some sense of human accountability, they introduced the concept of kasb, acquisition. Now, this means that while God creates the act, the human acquires it by performing it, thus bearing responsibility. Now, however, some note that this feels more like a semantic device than a genuine solution. The Ash'ari school sought a middle path between total human free will, which could limit God's authority, and total fatalism, which could make God appear unjust. Now, here's the thing. Not all Muslims have been comfortable with absolute predestination. The early school, known as the Mutazilites, insisted on authentic human free will, arguing that divine justice prevents God from predestining sin and then punishing people for it. Now, they reason that attributing all acts to God's will makes him the author of evil. No kidding. Nevertheless, the Mutazilites view lost favor in Orthodox Sunni Islam, where the Ash'ari position prevailed. Now, today, most Sunni Muslims affirm that Qadar, whether good or bad, is from Allah, all the while maintaining that humans will still be judged for their deeds. Now, this can create a tension within Islamic thought. So in sum, Islamic sources stress that Allah's will is supreme. The Quran and Hadith repeatedly say that guidance or misguidance is from Allah. Sunni theology speaks of human choices, but emphasizes that any choice we make was preordained and created by God. It is as though we are reading from a choose-your-own-adventure story, except God wrote all the possible branches and already knows which path each person will follow. Now, we must address a major implication of all of this. If Allah decrees every human act, why then does he reward or punish us for these acts? Now, see, this question has been a significant point of discussion among Muslims. The Mutazilites viewed it as contradictory to divine justice. Even the early companions of Muhammad struggled with how to explain it. One hadith found in Sahih Muslim and similarly in Sahih Bukhari indicates that Allah creates some people for paradise and some for hell. Now, when certain people asked why they should bother to strive if the outcome is already determined, Muhammad replies that for those created for paradise, Allah causes them to do deeds worthy of paradise. And for those created for hell, he causes them to do deeds for hell. Now, that language, causes them to do, raises the question of how it could be just to punish a person for evil deeds if God himself caused those deeds. Who's the author of evil here? See, the Quran also suggests that people will not believe except by Allah's permission. Now, this is in Surah 10, verse 100. Surah 2, verse 7 says, God has sealed the hearts and hearing of some people so they do not believe. Now, if a person's disbelief is Allah's will, on what basis are they morally blameworthy for unbelief? See, on a social level, consider the rule against apostasy. In a hadith found in Sahih Bukhari, hadith 3017, Muhammad is recorded saying, whoever changes his religion, kill them. Now, traditional Islamic law therefore prescribes execution for apostates in many interpretations. Yet if someone leaves Islam and embraces another belief system, that choice, too, is part of Allah's decree. So why punish someone for doing what was ultimately within the divine plan? See, it's a puzzling question. Typically, Islamic scholars respond by differentiating between God's decree and his pleasure. Now, but this does not easily resolve the tension that arises from God's active will being behind events that violate his moral commands. In Islam, disbelief, or kufr, is a grave offense. Yet if Allah decrees everything, does he decree disbelief for certain people? Now, the Quran in Surah 16, verse 93 states that if God had willed, he could have made everyone a single community of believers, but instead he leads astray whom he wills and guides whom he wills. Meanwhile, in the Quran in Surah 39, verse 7, it says, God does not approve of disbelief for his servants. Now, this raises a question of how God could will some people to be disbelievers while also disapproving of disbelief. Now, if he sincerely did not want any unbelief, he could have guided everyone to Islam. Why lead people astray if obedience is commanded? Now see, the Quran and Hadith both teach that Allah commands obedience and righteousness. Nevertheless, they also repeatedly say Allah leads astray those he chooses. Surah 14 verse 4, Surah 7 verse 178. Now, if God truly desires people to obey, it is unclear why he would intentionally steer some away from the path and then condemn them for disobedience. Now, let's look at the crucifixion deception. All right. Consider the Islamic claim in Surah 4 verse 157 that Jesus was neither killed nor crucified. Rather, it only appeared that way. Now, many Muslims hold that God caused someone else to resemble Jesus so that Christians believe Jesus died on the cross. If that is the case, it implies that God, knowing Christianity would hinge on the crucifixion and resurrection, orchestrated a scenario that misled billions of people for centuries. Now, this again creates tension between God's truthfulness and the notion that he would allow or even cause such a widespread misunderstanding. Now, let's contrast Christianity's view of free will. See, Christianity, like Islam, has debated free will and predestination, but the overarching biblical narrative is that God genuinely wills everyone to be saved. 1 Timothy 2 verse 4 says, God desires all people to come to knowledge of the truth. And 2 Peter 3 verse 9 says, he does not will any to perish, but for everyone to repent. Now, if people remain unbelievers, they do so contrary to God's will, rather than by his active decree forcing them to remain in error. Now, Christianity also stresses that love requires free will. C.S. Lewis famously argued that if God forced us to love him, we would be mere automatons. From Genesis onward, the Bible shows a dynamic in which humans can truly respond or reject God's invitation. Now, though some Christians emphasize predestination, for example, Calvinists, mainstream Christian thought still rejects the idea that God is the author of sin or unbelief in the same way Islamic tradition appears to. Now, instead, God permits free creatures to make their choices even while he offers sufficient grace for salvation. So does Islam allow for true free will? Now, based on the classical sources, it appears not. The Quran and Hadith strongly emphasize that nothing happens, nothing, except what Allah has decreed, including our beliefs and deeds. Muslims do affirm human accountability, but that's paired with texts that suggest Allah ultimately decides who is guided or misguided. Now, this presents moral and philosophical problems. How can a person be punished for what God caused or decreed? Why kill apostates if Allah's will governed their leaving Islam? And if God deceived people about the crucifixion, why fault those who believe in it if he is all-knowing? Christianity offers a contrasting picture in which God genuinely wants all people to believe, so that if someone rejects him, it is against God's desire, not in line with his predestined plan. See, from a Christian perspective, free will is critical for a real relationship of love. If you find this topic intriguing, it is worth investigating the primary sources. Read the Quran, read the Hadith, and the Bible for yourself. Compare how each faith portrays God's nature, human agency, and divine justice. Examine whether true moral accountability and a loving divine character align better with an all-determining will or a framework that allows for real human choice. As always, seek truth with sincerity, because if God is just, then he should be consistent with the very reason and moral sense he gave us. Thank you for your time. If you want to support this ministry, here are ways how. Peace out.